Welcome everybody to FHIR Questionnaires and Structured Data Capture. I'd like to introduce our speaker for today, Brian Postlethwaite. Brian, take it away.
Hello. I'm Brian Postlethwaite. I'm here to talk to you about FHIR Questionnaires and Structured Data Capture. Thank you everyone for putting your poll data in so I can get a bit of a feedback on who's here and what you want to see. It's a nice mix. And so, yeah, I'm a solutions architect from Telstra Health in Australia. Nice photo of me back when I was at one of the European events. I'm a co-chair at HL7 International, FMG member, .NET contributor, and specifically an implementer of SDC. So we've been using it for quite a long time, and since 2014. Enough about me. What are we covering? We just sort of want to get an understanding of the basics of FHIR questionnaires, how the SDC extends that basic capability, and have a look at how can we validate a questionnaire response against a questionnaire, what tooling's out there, and what do we see that's changing in R5 before it goes normative. And so without further ado, so I'll start off with, where do we use FHIR questionnaires? So we see them in our assessments in primary care, consumers fill out assessments, we do surveys, we do government statutory forms, we have referral templates, admission forms, care plans, all these different places where we often see questionnaires. So it's a very, very natural and normal thing to do. But once we've got a questionnaire, so that's really about how we use them. But when we look at what we're doing with them, there's a real workflow that happens. So we have to locate a questionnaire for a given context and all the different form types that we just went through. Each of those will have a different way of actually getting or discovering or being provided that questionnaire. We're not going to go into that today, and that's just sort of a precursor step. And once we've discovered it, we need to load it and render it. Maybe we'll do a pre-populate. There's another session coming later in the week by Ilya Beta, which will walk a little bit more into pre-population. And then, of course, we've got users entering the data, local validations. Then we can do the server side, and then responses get saved to a server. So what does one of these look like? So let's just have a quick look at what does a form look like. So I've got a handful of samples. So this is a sample government statutory form. And of course it's going to go to sleep. And so it's a simple sort of a form. We've got forms with various different properties that go on it, drop downs we might find, look ahead lists, Australia, not Austria, English. So you get all different types of controls that you can squeeze in, and more and more. So that sort of capacity. Then got a table test, so we can have tables with different content, and that type of thing squeezes into it. But that's jumping a little bit ahead on where we're at there. So we'll step on. So what do we get from questionnaire artifacts? So we start off with the questionnaire. It needs to come in. The questionnaire resource is the core definition resource. It's similar to structure definition if you've done much with FHIR and profiles. The structure definition defines what a normal resource is. A questionnaire just defines how a questionnaire should be represented, and that will potentially include references into the terminologies with the value set. And then there's the questionnaire response resource, which is about the data that a user enters in, which is the record of the response. And the internal structure of that, so the questionnaire relates back with the questionnaire response, which might hook to a patient, and the terminologies. So of quite an importance. So the structure of the questionnaire and the questionnaire response sort of match with those items within them. And then there's a whole heap of extensions. And just that last note there, don't profile questionnaires. So a questionnaire, so some implementation guides I see, I'll find a profile, a structure definition on questionnaire to try and describe what the form looks like. That's not the way to do it. You just create the questionnaire resource. That is the definition. The only reasons to create a profile on questionnaire would be if you wanted to have a subset of information. So you didn't support all of the questionnaire capabilities. So you could create a profile which would represent these are the level of capabilities that we can handle. So just looking at, well, what's in those resources? So really that there's, from the questionnaire side, we've got some metadata, which says, where is it appropriate to use this questionnaire? And then on the questionnaire response size is what context have I entered that in? So it was this questionnaire, it was for this patient at this time by this person, this sort of the context. And then the items underneath are the actual questions and groupings and data types that all fit around that description. And then, so we've got the basic data layout with the types, then we've got the data rules, so validation, so we've got another layer for that, and then we've got formatting hints. And then, so with that sort of a concept, we also have other layers where we can have pre-population rules, and so we can include those into the layer. We can include other rules on data extraction, so how we want to take that data from the questionnaire and put it out into other FHIR resources or into other formats altogether. It doesn't have to be FHIR. And the link ID must match, including the nesting depth. So when I've got a questionnaire and I go and enter it, the questionnaire response, the link ID must match between those two. So that's that side. So if we step on. So walking into the item type, because this is an awful lot of information, I'm not going to try and cover all of that all at once, but I'll go and pick out a couple of handfuls from there. So we've got a group, which is an item with children. It may or may not be repeating. So it could just be a section with a heading that's on a page, or it could be a grouping, or it could be a table, or it could be tabs. And displays are just a label. And then we'll notice we've got string and text, which is a short text or longer free text or multi-lines. And then we've got choices and open choices. So we've got that capability as well. So where did I pull that information from? It's a great question. I hear you ask quietly, wondering what's going on. And so that comes from the FHIR specification itself. So we're looking at R4. You can go to resources, alphabetical, to make it easy for myself. You can find questionnaire. And we'll find a whole lot of information about it. And we can see our questionnaire. We can see this top section, which is all the metadata around it. And then we'll find the collection of items with our link ID and some extra detail around that. And here's our item type, which we're looking at. So we can click through the item type, and then we can see that big table that we were looking at. So I'll just take that away. Those links I will make available. They're in the slides as well. And so with that, we sort of walk through, and so those questions themselves need to link off with terminology. So if I've got a set of possible values, say I've got a question to say, what country have you visited recently? Then I might have a drop down with a set of values. But then there's a large number of types, another country codes, which is in excess of 100. So maybe you want to have a different item control and say, well, don't you render as a drop down, render as a look ahead, so that they can start typing and it'll select and come in. So when we have those terminologies, we can either select them as just pure options via the answer options on the question. If I want to share them, so if I've got 12 questions on the same form that all have the same set of options, I can put a contained value set within the questionnaire definition and then just reference that. So I don't need to duplicate out those 12 questions everywhere. I can just have this one set and be there. Or if it's something that is a public value set, or not a public, but a one that's shared between multiple questionnaires that's on a terminology server, then I can just straight reference that terminology on the terminology service. Something like a link or a SNOMED code set would be quite a useful capacity there. And so we've got control selection. Also, I'll walk through that a little bit. There's a preferred terminology server extension, which says if the reference isn't explicit as to where to retrieve the terminology, or it's not on this particular forms service, then connect to this terminology server to resolve that terminology. And as with all the terminology services, it's expected just to use the expand operation with filter to go and extract that content. So we sort of talked a little bit about the basic data side of things. So when we move up to get some more dynamic behaviours, the most common thing that we sort of see is how do we enable and disable questions. So an example of that, let's see if I want to show a whole heap of extra questions, or once you've gotten to a specific point, if they've answered 3 different questions in a specific way, then we can hide off a certain set of questions because they're no longer relevant. Or I can have them hidden up until a certain point where they answer something, and then we'll go and create that. And so including that, so we'll indicate which question we want to enable on, whether it was an equals or whatever, and the specific value. And then if we can have multiple, so I could have 2 other fields that are dependent, and we've got an all or any to provide that capacity. Excuse me. So now if I need to get any more complex, or how do I do a more complicated situation where I want this question or this one, but only when this one and this one are in that case, that's when we walk out and we're looking in for a Firepath expression. So there's an extension for enable when that will support that. And so that's really where we want to walk to for that, which brings us to what's changing in R5. And the good part about this is there's very little that's actually changing between R4 and R5. Specifically, we added disabled display added. So when you've got enable when, that's going to disable it, this property tells you, should I be hiding it or should I just be marking it as read only? So there's sort of some control there. And then answer constraint has been added for options only, options or types, options or string. So in R4, we had open choice and choice, and these have been changed to just say coding. So that's what we're expecting to get there. And then we'll combine that with the answer constraint option to say, instead of open choice, we'll say answer constraint, answer coding, and answer constraint of options or string. So, so adopting R4 is a good thing. And there's only a very minor update to move on to R5. So that brings us to structured data capture. So the core spec is really around that base level of data. So base definition of questions, what are the base definition of rules that fit within that, and sort of that base level presentation with a little bit of behavior with that core enable when. But then we walk into the structured data capture, and it really goes that next level to give you a whole lot more capability. It sort of breaks things down by what is the role that your component or feature is actually dealing with. And so if you're just managing forms, you're a forms library, that's the sort of area you want to look at. If you're managing or processing data submitted from questionnaires, you're a form response manager and possibly a receiver as well. If you're just creating stuff and then archiving it, that's you. But a lot of people just end up in the form filler where you've got the renderer to provide that. And so it really goes in advanced rendering, advanced behaviors, adaptive forms, which I'm not going to walk into. But the short version of adaptive forms, it's where there isn't a complete definition of what the questionnaire to fill in is. And the server can dynamically work out, well, here's a handful of questions, answer those and send me the results. And then I'll give you more questions to actually fill out. And then importing data into and extracting out of forms. Ilya Beta's going to talk a little bit about that later. And if I get some time, I might sneak in a little bit of data there too. And if you've been to any of my talks before, or you've been following the progress of the SDC guide, it's been nearly ready for publish for quite a while. And we are really nearly there. People keep giving good feedback and we keep enhancing. But it's been quite stable for quite a period of time. So a quick walkthrough of all of that. Where are we going? So on top of our base definition, we have a set of profiles. So going from the questionnaire page, so where we had our structure, there's our profiles and extensions section, which where we'll find some extra extensions, so some design notes. Entry format is the little tooltip, or not tooltip, the ghost text that you might find in a control before you start typing. Extra validation rules, so display, size, maximum values, MIME types, minimum lengths, minimum values. So a good set of additional content. Min occurs, max occurs. So if you've got a table that has a set of rows in it, but you only want to capture between 2 and 10, then you can have a minimum 2, but maximum 10. Option exclusive is another good one. So if you've got a multi-select set of options to say A, B, C, D, and D is none of the above, you could say D is an option exclusive. Yeah, so that was just a quick tip to say there are a lot more extensions in the core spec. And then we walk over to profiles. So this is the advanced rendering page. So within that, we find we've got some rendering styles. So rendering XHTML. So if you're painting a label and you want to use more than just a simple bit of text, you can say, here's some XHTML. And there's also a markdown extension. So if you wanted to have the particular bit of text in bold, you can use the markdown for that. Categories, hidden, item control. So the item control's a very useful one. So we use it an awful lot. And it actually gives you the capacity to indicate with this particular control, I want this group to be painted as a table, a H table or a G table, which is a H table is a horizontal answers. So where the columns in the table are possible answers to rows. And yeah, so groups. So quite a few different styles where text fits. So with the questions, so autocomplete. So we saw with that country list where I just started typing in AU and then showed underneath Australia, Austria, or drop downs, check boxes, lookups, and text boxes. So you get a little bit of extra control through there. So I'll close those. And sliders, widths, collapsibles. So a lot of extra capability. So then on from there, we had the rendering. So that's rendering. Did I include that twice? No, behavior. So behaviors. So this is where we get even more. So max lengths, min lengths. So we've got regular expressions for validations, min max quantities. So if you're using quantity values, and some of these have been redefined, not redefined, but included in the IG as well. Answer options, so we can restrict some of those. This is the answer expression, which is that validation technique. Repeating, read-only, min-occurs. So you get all of that sort of capability. Then we've got calculations, so you can do calculated expressions that fit within that. And we do have a whole section on expressions. So expressions use the Firepath language to be able to do various different things. And so we've got capacity to have variables. So if you wanted to have a particular control, have a calculated expression, which I should find down here, calculated expression. So we can say that this particular question is calculated by creating a weight of the last 3 questions with various formats divided by the total number. So that's the type of thing we can do with a calculated expression. And we can use a variable to store some information during that processing so that we can reuse it in multiple expressions. So very useful. Initial expression is used when doing a pre-population, and it also draws from the launch context. So that's where we find expression information. Going on that, and behavior we just walked through. So there was a validation expression. Where's that? See that now, but we get to it later. Yeah, so what do we use those Firepath expressions for that we just saw from the course, from the SDC IG? We can use them for doing validation. We can use them for pre-population and initial values. So the validation you can do cross-field, so that this date, the review date has to be after the assessment date, and the assessment date has to be after the incident date, and the incident date has to be after the birth date. So you can do those sort of validation checks. So that's expressions. So I'll go through a couple of examples from our demo site. So we saw, I talked a little bit about enable when. So let's just jump straight into this table test, and it's got some questions in it. I'm going to go straight to save, and we'll see straight away we've got a simple validation which says you need to have a date, a specimen collection date. All right, well, let's give it a date. Save. Oh, well, that's great. But you can see now it said you've created a future date. So I've actually got an expression validating that content to say that must be less than or equal to today for that to pass. And then these ones have got some validations going server-side to handle that as well. And so you can see there that that sort of capacity comes through. So that's a little bit of nice capacity there. So that's basic enable when. So I've got, well, how far can you go with enable when? So I've got this questionnaire where I can say this field is only shown when question 1 is true. I can click it, and it says this is a different question, which is when it's false. So you can see that sort of behavior. So I've got a decimal field, so 1, 5, and so I can see now that if it's greater than 4.6, 0.8, so you get that level of control. So I've got greater than or equal to. You get those sort of capacities. You can do it with dates as well. So it happens to be greater than that. So if I go back, skip all the way back, we can see how it hides and shows based on when that's occurring. And I think you can get the idea of what's going on here. Now, this was an interesting one. So if I put in the word test, you can see now we've got equals test is greater than test. And all of these things depend on what is supported by the renderer. And so during the last Connectathon, we were going and working out who was implementing this the same way, and discovered that this renderer that we're viewing here, which is from Telstra Health, was the only one doing greater than or less than, and doing string comparisons with greater than or less than. So, which was kind of funny. Yeah. And so multi-select, so which is a case of where you've got multiple selections, you get different combos, which is really useful. And the same with radios, so which is a single select. So this is actually a list, a choice control. That's a choice, and the only difference between them is saying that this one is repeats, whereas this one, we want item control as a radio set. And that was the last one I was working on, which doesn't work yet. So what did I get? Bit of everything. That was another good one. So a bit of everything is really just a quick sampler of a string, a text, Boolean, date, time, integer, to show each of those different styles of controls. A drop-down list, auto-complete style list, and there's a good example there. If I go and try it, these are both choice lists. One is an open choice and the other one's a choice. So this particular one will allow a string just to be entered, whereas this one has to actually have a value from this. And yeah, that should save quite happily. Yep, so that does. So that shows that sort of stuff. And just for a bit of fun, I threw a couple of others in that I pulled from around the place. So this is a questionnaire that I happened to grab. I can't remember whether it was through the keynote this morning or the second session. Was one of the guides had a simple COVID questionnaire, and I thought I'd have a look at that. And there's obviously been a lot more that's been added in the client than is defined in this definition. But they did put the enable when capability and said, I have a sign of symptoms. So they've actually changed some of these lower labels. And I've had contact with a victim. And so they say we need to do a clinical assessment, recent travel. And I think what's normally expected is that these other controls down there are actually meant to be labels that have a large amount of text in it, which would be a good use of Markdown or XHTML to put additional data in. And then the last one. Yeah, so that was a nice little demo there. And another one, someone submitted one to my server for about getting coffees. And they included a capacity to render the XHTML to show your coffee, which we don't support. And
hey, Brian.
Yep.
You do have a number of questions.
Oh, cool.
In
Thank
Whova,
you.
I just wanted to direct you there. I don't know
Yep.
when you want to handle them.
So increase the, okay. Will do. Q&A. So there's so one of the questions, actually I'll come back to a couple of those. I'll jump through. So validation, I'll quickly touch on, then I'll run back to the questions and that. So validation is done in multiple passes. So when we do submit, it'll first check, is this valid XML or JSON? Is it a valid profile, if there's one of those involved? And then it does questionnaire response validation, which does the item types to data types. So if the questionnaire definition says, I'm expecting a date, and you give it a string, it'll fail that. If you've got a terminology involved, it'll check that the option, the coding that you've provided is from that value set. It'll check for required values. And one of the interesting parts is when you're marking a question as enable when, to say that this field is not considered, and that question has a mandatory field, if you're validating the required stuff, you should consider what's going on with the enable when. And then there can be also other server-side content, plus the answer expressions that we went through, and then display that content. And so I did a little bit about what that cross-field validation could look like. And then when it comes back and gives you some results, this is the sort of error message that you'll get back. So all errors in FHIR come back as an operation result. So just as the same as if you submitted a patient resource and that failed for some reason. So in this first particular issue, we've got a required field, mandatory field, severity is missing, and it tells you where it is on the form that you've entered. And so if I look at this second error that's coming back, remember I did that specimen date in the future that was collected. This is saying that field can be a future date. That was the expression that I put in the diagnostics to say the value was meant to be less than that, and that's where I can go and show that error message. Now, where are some of these renderers? So that there are quite a lot out there, and every time I look, there's more. So the first one that we wanted to look at, which I'll quickly show, is this is the NLM rendering. So I actually loaded in that same form that we looked at just before, which had each of these labels. And so you can see as I go and tick in content, recent travel, age verification, clinical assessment. So that's that same sort of behavior. So that's the NLM tool set. That's an open source set, and do chat to Paul Lynch. There's also a handful of others. So this FHIR or Firefly dev. So that was from the keynote this morning that they've been working with. There's also Firepower. They've got a specific rendering. They also have an editor as well. This is our tech demo from Telstra Health. And down the right, it was a whole heap of different GitHub projects in various states of various people that have been working through it. The top one there is my most recent one I started a few weeks ago to try one out in Vue.js and beta software. So Ilya Peter is speaking on that later this week, and some Angular and some React, all different projects. There is a link there where you'll find all these other implementations listed. And along with that, there's creating the questionnaires. So the US National Library of Medicine's LHC Forms Builder, which we just looked at a little bit, which was that one. Is one of the most recent ones. Graham Greaves' Fire Toolkit has one in it. The one from Telstra Health, ours is broken still. We've been upgrading that from DSTU 2 to 4. And once again, there's a handful of those. And if you're doing expressions, so with Firepath, highly recommend the tool I built, Firepath Tester, which is really useful for actually going through and say, use a questionnaire and go and find what are the questions. If you've got an error message and I wanted to see where it is in the instance, I can pop that in there, put the expression up there, and it'll go and take me straight to it. So it's quite a useful tool. So I'll run back to those questions that we've got. So I'll just run down from the top. So the first question I can see there is the questionnaire seems to couple data and presentation. The presentation aspect has not been standardized as far as I know. This does make the presentation, well, yes and no. So along with the SDC guide and the item control, there is a great deal of presentation information there. The anticipation is that you'll not get an exact representation because when we go between different devices, you'll get some people with a large form factor, some with web applications, some with native client applications, some with tablets, some with phones. And each of those different environments will have a different experience. And when I go and drag that into a native application as well, I might have a different style of rendering. So my date controls look different, but the behavior is what we really go about describing. So how do we expect this to be done? And so that's really where we try and focus it. So yeah, that's really what I hope. But between the base specification, having the questionnaire definition and the questionnaire response data, there should be enough there to really cover that. I hope I've answered that, Melanie. So I'll walk down to the next one. If I'm in control of the client using my API, why would I bother creating a questionnaire? And the question that consumed it. Yeah, so it's exactly right. It's when you've got third parties. So if I'm doing referrals templates, my system's not the one I care about. I want to make sure that when I've got data coming in from an external referring agency, that they collect the data that I want to see. And I want to be sure that that data has the best quality it has. So I'll include the rules that they can render and validate on their side. So I don't have to, I know that the quality of that data will be greatly improved. And it also means that I've got a single rendering. So if I've got multiple product lines, I can share that and integrate quite happily. So it does make that integration experience a little better. So I hope I've answered that one. Can I use an emoji as an option in a questionnaire? Yes, through the XHTML. In fact, that was one of the, in fact, I'll show what that looks like in the definition. That one. Where'd it go? So there's an option, plain mug, and with a rendering XHTML. And you will just include the image with the data in line. So that would be how you could do that, if that's answered that question. Can restrictions while creating questionnaires give us a biased data? How to manage the same? We obviously don't want to collect any junk data as well. So yes, you can get biased data, but really that comes down to questionnaire design. So I think whoever's creating that design, that's really their prerogative to work out how to do that. I'm just going to show the questions on here as well, so people can see what we're looking at. Cool. Can you show the FHIR resources used to create the questionnaires you're showing? Did you want to come off mute and give a little bit more detail on that one?
Well, it just seems like your presentation is very high level oriented. You're giving us a few specifics of what can happen, but you're basically showing us the GUIs and not the FHIR resources that most of us are going to be, or at least presumably if we're developers, going to be looking to defining and designing.
So if you wanted to dive down into what they look like, that's not a problem at all. In fact, all the ones we were just looking at, which one of these is going to be quicker?
And if you want to pick one simple one, that's fine. I'm not saying you have to do all.
Yep. So which one of the ones that we looked at would you like to see? The hot beverage one?
Surprise me.
Surprise you. All right, we'll have a look at the enable when tests. So from that, we've got, actually, I'll go to an even simpler one. That COVID simple. So it started off, had a link ID, so an item at the top, which is our sign of symptoms, which is a Boolean. They've included a code just for their internal purposes so that they can map internally, I'm imagining. They've got another bool. So these are quite simple questionnaires. And then with that, so then we've got a display value. And so we're saying when this particular sign of symptoms has a value of false, then we'll display that particular label. There's an equal. So it's pretty simple.
Okay. It's at least a little bit of a flavor. Thank you.
Yeah. And so here's another one just to see something that has a little bit more detail. So a pre-populate. Actually, that's a good sample. I'll go over to that. Populate. So load. And of course, that's not going to work, is it? Yeah, it's not going to work. All right. I won't do that. Yeah, so we can get to see some of that content. So use code focus. So a link item. This one's a group. Has a nested item with a string. This one got marked down. No, it doesn't. Thought it did. Okay, so that's just a bit of a sample.
Yep, thank you.
Yep, no worries, you're welcome. Actually, yeah, one last demo just before I run off from that. So going back to, so if you're trying stuff out, so we've got our rendering here, which is loading them up. So we can look at that hot beverage. can see that content in there. If I go and look at the developer tools and see what's going on, and go and save that. Oh, actually, you can see up the top here. Actually, I'll go back. Sorry. So select one, hot beverage. We can see that's the hot beverage one. We can then enter some data, Brian with sugar, and make 5, save. Now I should find up in the top here, we've now got a questionnaire response. And then in down the bottom, we've got our hot beverage. We gave it a value of 5 for the rating. I had a coding of sugar with sugar, and I entered my name. So that's how the answer gets in. And we can see it's nested under a root level. So that's really wandered through. So I hope that's covered off those questions.
And Brian, we're at time right now.
That's what I thought. So yeah, I'm on GitHub, on Hoover, that's my email address. There is another session from Ilya Beta coming up where he's going to do a live coding session to walk through some of this. So you might be interested in looking at that. And he'll cover populate and extract, which are 2 of the partner areas. Cool. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Brian. That was a really great session. If you do have questions and you didn't get them answered, you can still post them in Hoover, and Brian can go in there and answer those at his leisure. Thanks for everyone for joining, and please make sure you rate this session.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Brian.